So this is lecture burst number 2, and we're continuing talking about Freud. We left off on the last one, discussing id, ego, and superego, and really the id trying to satisfy basic sexual and aggressive drives, operating on the pleasure principle. And really, this is the part of our unconscious mind that Freud would say demands instant gratification, can't delay that gratification, has to have it and has to have it now. You can think of like a newborn infant crying for satisfaction. They don't care for anything outside the world's conditions or the world's demands. They are only concerned about their own needs. That's all they know. Or maybe closer to home, Freud would argue that people with a present rather than future time perspective, people who are just in the here and now, might be those who use tobacco or alcohol or other drugs. Like, I'm concerned with pleasure right here, right now. I don't care what it's going to do to me later. So they'd no sooner want to party now than sacrifice today's pleasures for future success, happiness, health, or just a longer life. And so that's the id. And then the ego is functioning sort of as the executive mediator, I guess you could say, mediating the demands of the id and the superego. It operates according to the reality principle. Like, in reality, what's possible? What can we do? What can't we do? And this ego develops as a young child's responding to the world and is learning what's right and what's wrong, morality, as we discussed in chapter 8. And it seeks to satisfy the id's urges, but in realistic ways that will bring long-term pleasure. And so it also contains our partly conscious perceptions, our thoughts, our judgments, and memories. But then it's always sort of struggling to maintain a balance between the id and the superego. And the superego is what provides standards for judgment. It's our conscience, right? We always say, well, what does your conscience tell you? Our conscience is that piece that aspires for better, that has future aspirations, that wants to do right? It's the voice we think of as our moral compass or our conscience. We're not going to get philosophical or religious, but some would argue, well, where does that come from? Why are we built with knowing kind of some essentials of what's right and what's wrong? Where does that even start? Are we taught it? Because even at a young age, before a child understands right and wrong, they kind of have a sense. And so it focuses on how we ought to behave. It strives for perfection, and it judges actions and produces positive feelings of like pride or negative feelings of guilt. And so it can be hard, because who can attain that, right? Who can attain the perfection and demands of the superego? Well, there's where the ego comes into play, is it's always trying to mediate the unrealistic id that could do wrong versus the idealistic superego that always does super right and finds a kind of common middle ground. And that's like the best way to explain it. Now, Freud would say that we use defense mechanisms as a way to protect ourselves. It's our ego's sort of job in mediating the id and the superego. And those defense mechanisms are basically unconscious distortions of a person's perception of reality. And their goal is to reduce stress and anxiety. So something's causing me stress and anxiety. It's a situation, it's a feeling I'm having, and I want it to go away. So I employ certain sort of defense mechanisms. I put up my defenses in an attempt to allay or deal with that anxiety that I'm having, hoping that it'll make it go away. The only problem is sometimes those defense mechanisms just build up walls and they don't allow the person to properly deal with what's going on. So they're not always the best method. And you're going to see there's an assignment this week dealing with defense mechanisms. It's an extra credit, but it's also one of your Hawk readings. And so this is going to be built into the discussion for this week that you guys are going to be having in your homework, right? So the things that you're going to be talking about in terms of Hawk reading 8.2 covers Freud's defense mechanisms. What are they? How do they operate? What do they look like? So you'll be talking about that there in your homework. And then I have a worksheet that's for extra credit that has you identifying people's usage of defense mechanisms. So hopefully that will help you out a little bit. Freud's psychosexual stages basically were divided into segments that he said were pieces of your personality that developed over time, starting at early infancy, actually at birth. So we had the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, which are kind of like the primary stages he focuses on, and then we have latency and the genital phase. Now, see, Freud was very centered on the unconscious, right? And all that reservoir that lurks beneath the surface. So he believed that personality was formed very early in life, and that during these stages that he proposed, the id was sort of developing its pleasure-seeking drives and its focus on pleasure, sensitive to the body, right? So this is definitely one of Freud's most controversial theories. And he said that, you know, during the stage that you're in, the focus is different, right? So oral stage, the id is centered on pleasure seeking, and that is generally found in the mouth. When an infant, right, derives all their pleasure from sucking. They have that sucking reflex, biting, chewing, everything, you know, an infant puts in their mouth. Like, it doesn't matter what it is, because that is how they're exploring their world, and that is where they seek their pleasure from. It's where they achieve their food source and their nutrition. As they move up into 18 to 36 months, they enter into the anal phase, which, if anybody has younger siblings or has babysat, you know that these are the potty training years. So appropriately named the anal phase, where pleasure focuses on bowel and bladder elimination. And if you know anything about potty training, why it's so tough is because it's the child's chance for rebellion. It's the only thing a child can control at that age is their bowel movements. They can choose when and where to go potty. And so we see a lot of stubbornness come out, and Freud would say that that is the id, you know, exercising its control over the child. And he would also say that, you know, if you do not successfully navigate these stages with appropriate resolution, like successful potty training and successful passing of the oral stage, like if you still have a child that's 6 and is sucking their thumb, you haven't successfully passed this stage, and that's going to carry over, and so forth. Freud would say that it was necessary to get past these stages in order for personality to really ripen and develop in appropriate ways. It turns into the phallic stage as that child is learning more about their body parts, right? 3 to 6 years old, the child's exploring and realizing, hey, I'm a boy, you're a girl, what that all means. And they might be coping, Freud would say, with some innocuous sorts of unconscious sexual feelings, like nothing that is sexual in the sense that we think of it as, but just knowing their body, right? And then as it moves into 6 years old to puberty, we see dormant sexual feelings and then maturation of sexual interests in the genital phase. One of the most controversial of Freud's theories was the Oedipus complex, which happens during the phallic stage. Oedipus was named after the Greek god, Greek legend, Oedipus Rex. If any of you read that in high school, Oedipus Rex unknowingly killed his father and married his mother. Freud believed that during the phallic stage, boys seek genital stimulation and they develop both unconscious sexual desires towards their mom and jealousy and hatred for their dad, whom they consider a rival. And he said that boys also experience guilt and they fear punishment for this. Perhaps castration punishment, giving them castration anxiety from their father. And that the female equivalent to this would be the Electra complex in reverse. So that was definitely controversial, right? We don't know how we feel about that and where we sit with that. And most of the Neo-Freudians today kind of abandoned this whole theory and didn't find a lot of weight to it. But that is what Freud spent a lot of time talking about. And in order to successfully navigate these stages, he said that it's essential for the male child to cope with those feelings by forming an identification with the male figure. And that in doing so, the superego gains strength there, incorporates the parent's values and a bond with dad, and it helps that child identify with the rival parent that they're having these sort of, remember, id-driven negative feelings towards. So he's explaining that at any point along the stage process of psychosocial development, there could be a locking or fixating on a particular stage in which that stage isn't navigated successfully, right? So a person who had been maybe overly indulged or deprived at the oral stage, perhaps by an abrupt weaning, early weaning off breastfeeding, that infant might fixate at the oral stage, and that fixation could later manifest in adult years by the person exhibiting a passive dependence or an exaggerated denial of the dependence through acting tough or using biting sarcasm. And the person might seek to continue oral gratification through smoking or excessive eating. And so, again, Freud is really saying that the person's personality is marked at an early age, and that manifests later in later stages. Now, the Neo-Freudians were Jung, Adler, Horney, and Erikson. They developed some competing psychoanalysis theories, but they each kind of branched off in their own way off of where Freud started. Their focus was on psychoanalysis, interpreting people's personality, but in a more modern way. Jung believed that we had a collective unconscious. That was the name that he gave for all the memories shared by all members of the human species, that we sort of have memories for everything our human species has encountered. And he sort of worked that into his understanding of personality. Alfred Adler proposed that we had feelings of inferiority, and that was the driving force behind personality. And he also developed birth order theory. So some of you are interested in birth order and how that plays a role in how we develop. You know, are you the firstborn or the middle child or the oldest? And he had a lot to say for that there. Horney took Freud's stuff and basically talked a little bit more about anxiety. Karen Horney kind of went off on her own in terms of where does anxiety come from? Why is it a tenet of certain people's personalities? She rejected a lot of Freud's theories about some of the psychosexual stages and urges and focused a little bit more on anxiety perspectives. And then Erik Erikson developed his theory more on social aspects rather than sexual relationships. And he covered the entire lifespan. As you guys know, we covered that in the developmental chapter where he talked about the psychosocial stages of development, that it covers the entire lifespan, and we go through these pivotal moments at each juncture in our life. And if we navigate them successfully, we gain kind of a good sense of ourselves and carry that with us. If we don't navigate them successfully, we don't do that. So that's where I'm going to stop here for this one, and we'll get into the next topic on the next lecture burst.